This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This new Theology Bits series is structured around gratitude and grief. And this is tied to our season of creation that we are doing here at Central Lutheran in beginning June 29th and continuing through the month of July. And our theme is gratitude and grief. There's a lot to be said about how this relates to creation, but this video will first be an overview of just what are these two things: gratitude and grief, and how they relate to one another. And we're going to be doing that looking at the book of Ezra, chapter 3. And I want to provide just a little bit of background, because this might not be a narrative everyone knows. That is, the book of Ezra is upon the return of the people of Israel to the land after exile. So it's returned from exile around the year 539 BCE. And the narrative is that they had been taken off into exile, most people in 586 BC, and then into Babylon, and then completely unrelated to anything to do with Israel, why the Persian Emperor Cyrus conquers Babylon. And what Cyrus allows the edict of an edict that all of the slaves and captives are allowed to return home of these client kingdoms that Babylon had destroyed, one of which was Israel. The book of Ezra describes this, and then we also have the so-called Cyrus Cylinder, which is a record from Persia that describes this same incident. And so they're able to allowed to go home. But it's important very quickly that when they return, they will not be a nation. Instead, they will be a province. And according to Ezra, this is not in the Cyrus Cylinder, but according to Ezra, the book of Ezra, that is, also Cyrus wanted them to rebuild their temple so they could pray for the Persian Empire, the Persian emperor, or maybe just empire. That is to say that they are allowed to return, but it's not the same as what it was. So on the one hand, they're going to have a lot of gratitude. They're allowed to go back to their own land, but grief because things aren't the way they expected. And we should also recognize most do not return. Instead, most people remain living in what's called diaspora, or dispersion, or spread throughout the world. So this is just the basic context. Well, the situation in Ezra 3 is they come back and they want to rebuild Jerusalem, and specifically to rebuild the foundation of the temple. Temple was destroyed in 586, and because of the theology of Deuteronomy, there's not going to be another temple. This is the only temple and the only one that they can do. And what happens when they rebuild it? Well, the one seems sort of obvious. That is, there is joy and acclamation. And that seems to fit, right? They've rebuilt this temple. They've been desperately wanting this temple for so long, and now they finally can. But the narrative also says, but then there was also weeping. And it says the weeping was there for all of those who remembered the old temple. They remembered what Solomon's temple was about, and it was so profound that both things were happening at once, and it was not possible to distinguish one from the other. This is going to be the narrative that we want to analyze a little bit today. So, the first thing to understand of what's going on here is that the temple, the first temple, the theology of the temple as they knew it, was tied very closely with the Davidic kingship. Meaning David and David's descendants. And David's descendants had a special covenant. And there was a covenant with David, where we first get, by the way, the language of father and son with respect to David and God. But in this covenant, we have David is going to be a king and on the throne forever, David and David's line. And it's going to end up, David himself doesn't get to build the temple, his son does. Solomon builds the temple, and the temple is put in the same place that the palace is. And in fact, it's the same builder, Hiram of Tyre, builds them both. And they build them to be parallel, to the point that the temple has the covenant. The temple has the covenant just the same way that David is. Now, in the actual covenant in 2 Samuel, it doesn't say anything about the temple being part of it, but it's tied together. And because the temple is not the tabernacle, it doesn't move, the place becomes fully tied together. Or we might call Mount Zion, Jerusalem, the whole place becomes part of the kingship. So the kingship is the temple, is the mountain. That is, this is the theology that you see that in the first temple period, that there is one temple and only one temple, and just as David cannot lose the throne because of God's covenant, so can the temple not be destroyed and the place cannot be overrun. Sometimes it's called the inviolability of Zion, and you see it reflected, say, in the book of 1 Isaiah, or the first part of the book of Isaiah, or in the Psalms, several Psalms. And the whole point of it is, this is where God's name dwells. And it is how God relates with us. And God is the one who will make the kingship last, the place last, the temple last. And then introduce the Babylonian exile in 586 when it doesn't last. When the covenant has been lost. So when they come back, they have complicated feelings. Because on the one hand, of course there is joy, they have a temple again. The temple was a key part of how they worship God. To not have it mean there was no sacrifice, there was no worship center, question whether the covenant was still the covenant. That, there's a lot of joy. They finally have it back. But there is weeping. And there is weeping on the one hand is because they remember Solomon's and how much better Solomon's was. But I think there's weeping for more. Because what they're weeping is this, even though they've rebuilt the temple, this dynamic is no longer there. The place obviously can be conquered. The temple obviously can be destroyed. The kingship obviously can be broken. They're not getting the kingship again. Their rulers are Persian governors. And so, what do we have? On the one hand, they give thanks because God is faithful. And God has brought them back and has provided a new temple, and in that temple they can worship that God is thankful. After such an amazing ordeal that most of us are not going to be able to fathom, they finally can have a temple again. But they deeply grieve. And they're grieving not really the beauty of this. They're grieving what they see as a lost covenant, or at least a covenant that's going to be very long delayed. Because building this temple in this circumstance isn't going to help increase the time in which they're going to have the nation again. It's going to decrease it. You've now found another way. This temple, just like the last one, could be destroyed. The idea of inviolability is gone forever. And how is God going to be faithful? Well, obviously in new ways. And so we are led to is this concept of gratitude and grief. This was one particular example, but I would suggest this is the example we always are holding tension with. That is to say that really these are the same thing. That every time we give thanks for the gifts we've been given, every time we also grieve the loss of gifts we used to have and we don't anymore. Or maybe we simply grieve how incredibly temporary the gifts we have are. That how incredibly temporary our life is. So that we give thanks, but we also grieve loss. Because beyond it all, it suggests that everything, and this is where we're going to get to for next time when we get into creation, is not our own. So we give thanks for it and we grieve it. Because at once, it is not ours and we ourselves are not our own. Nothing is permanent. Everything is temporary within this creation. And so we do give gratitude for God, for God's consistency, but grief for ourselves, for our inconsistency and our temporality. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.